The surrender came on the 15th of February 1942. 130,000 men, British, Australian, Indian, and Gurkha, laid down their arms in Singapore. It was the largest capitulation in British military history, and it happened in a place thought to be an impregnable fortress. The news hit London like a thunderbolt. For decades, the white man had ruled Asia with a confidence that seemed unshakable, but in a few short weeks, a smaller Japanese army had swept down the Malayan peninsula through what everyone called impenetrable jungle, and shattered that myth for good. The scale of the disaster was almost impossible to grasp. Soldiers who had marched in neat columns just months before were now prisoners, marched off to labor camps and railway projects that would kill tens of thousands. The roar of the guns fell silent. The tropical heat pressed down on the stunned, disarmed masses. And in the hushed aftermath, a terrible question began to form in the minds of the survivors and their commanders back in India. How had this happened? How had a supposedly inferior Asian enemy used the jungle to defeat the might of the British Empire? To answer that, we must turn the clock back to a world that seemed far more certain. In the late 1930s, the British Army in the Far East was a garrison force, not a fighting army. Its doctrine was built for parade grounds and open battlefields, not the dripping, close-horizoned world of the tropical rainforest. Officers played polo, drank pink gin, and believed that the Japanese were a second-rate enemy, short-sighted, afraid of the dark, and incapable of serious fighting. The jungle itself was seen as a barrier to movement, not a highway for it. It was an attitude of comfortable and ultimately fatal complacency. J.P. Cross, a young Gurkha officer who would spend a lifetime in these jungles, knew the truth that the High Command refused to see. The jungle was never impassable. It was a place of semi-twilight, of constant damp, of rotting leaves and stifling heat. It required a special kind of soldiering, a modified soldiering, that the textbooks in Sandhurst had never taught. The men who understood this best were not the British, but the Japanese, who had spent years training in the close country of Taiwan and Hainan, learning to live off little and move fast. When the Japanese struck on the 8th of December 1941, they did not come with heavy tanks or long columns of trucks. They came on bicycles, thousands of them, carrying only their rifles, ammunition, and a meager 2.5 pounds of rations per man per day. They bypassed British roadblocks by slipping through the rubber plantations and coconut groves, moving through terrain the defenders thought would hold them. They used infiltration, not frontal assault. They outflanked every prepared position, appearing behind the lines with terrifying speed, often in a matter of hours. The British soldier was laden with a greatcoat, a steel helmet, a respirator, a pack, a haversack, and heavy hobnailed boots. The Japanese soldier wore light cotton uniforms and rubber-soled shoes. He could cook and eat a meal in 15 minutes. He moved at night as confidently as by day. The British relied on motor transport that bogged down on muddy tracks. The Japanese carried their own supplies on their backs or used captured vehicles. It was a clash of two different worlds of warfare, and the world that was lighter, faster, and more ruthless won every time. The retreat was a long, bloody nightmare. A young officer named Spencer Chapman, left behind in Malaya to wage a guerrilla war, watched men die not from bullets or disease, but from sheer lack of the right mental attitude. They were afraid of the jungle itself, more afraid of it than they were of the enemy. The Japanese fed on that fear. They seemed like supermen, experts in the dark, invincible, and their cruelty to prisoners only made them more terrifying. The myth of the jungle Superman was born in those desperate weeks, and it would take years of hard fighting to kill it. The final disaster came at the Sitang River Bridge in Burma on the 22nd of February, 1942. To prevent the Japanese from crossing, the British blew the bridge, but the timing was catastrophic. On the far bank, hundreds of Gurkha soldiers were stranded, separated from their own army. Many were lost. The Gurkhas, who had fought with absolute loyalty for generations, never forgot that moment. It became a lasting wound, a memory of abandonment that would resurface in bitter conversations for decades after the war. The fall of Singapore was the consequence of that entire catastrophic chain. The white man's prestige in Asia was destroyed overnight. The colonial populations who had been told their masters would protect them now saw them led away in chains. The British Empire was badly shaken, and the Japanese for a time seemed unstoppable. The jungle, which the Allies had treated as a barrier, had become the Japanese soldiers' greatest ally. Yet even in that crushing defeat, seeds of recovery were planted. A few men understood that the jungle was neutral, not a weapon for either side. They knew that the Japanese were not supermen, just soldiers who had trained harder for this specific environment. The long, painful process of unlearning old prejudices and building a new jungle warfare doctrine was about to begin. But first, the Allies had to face the worst hour of the war in Asia. They had to learn to crawl through the mud and the leeches before they could ever hope to stand and fight. One of those men was William Slim. He was appointed commander of the newly formed 14th Army in 1943. Slim knew that defeat was not inevitable. He rebuilt the army's spirit from the ground up. He insisted on aggressive patrolling and proper jungle training. He also understood that logistics were the key to victory. Without reliable supply, no army could fight in that green hell. The first test of new thinking came in February 1943. Major General Ord Wingate launched the first Chindit operation, Operation Longcloth. 3,000 men were flown deep behind Japanese lines in Burma. They were supplied entirely by air. The concept was bold, long-range penetration to disrupt enemy communications, but the cost was terrible. Of the 3,000 men who went in, only about half returned. The Chindits proved that air supply could work in the jungle. Men like Charles Moore, a company sergeant major in the King's Regiment, remembered the strain. Moore wrote about the confusion of jungle patrols, where verbal messages turned into jokes and crises, yet the men kept fighting. Private J. Lindo of the same unit recalled the terror of being ambushed at night. He described a Burmese guide who saved his life, feeding him stew and leading him back to safety. Wingate's tactics were controversial. Many senior officers thought they wasted scarce resources, but the psychological effect was enormous. The Japanese were no longer seen as unbeatable. The Chindits had proved that Allied troops could operate in the jungle, hundreds of miles from any road, and survive. The lesson was not lost on Slim. He began to integrate air supply into all his planning. The Japanese, however, were far from finished. They launched a major offensive into India in March 1944. Operation U-Go aimed to capture Imphal and Kohima. The goal was to smash 14th Army and drive into the Indian plain. The Japanese believed their spiritual superiority would carry the day. They outran their supply lines just as they had in Malaya. This time, the Allies were ready. Before the main Japanese thrust, the Battle of the Admin Box had already shown the way. In February 1944, the Japanese surrounded the 7th Indian Division near Ungakyadauk. They cut the road, certain that the division would surrender or starve, but the division held its ground. It formed an all-round defensive perimeter. Aircraft dropped supplies into a small jungle clearing. The men inside the box fought off repeated attacks. Nakam Gurung of the 4th Gurkha Rifles was in that box. He described 16 days without rations. He and his section crept out at night to cut bamboo shoots and banana plants. They sucked the moisture from the plants to survive. Nakam Gurung later led a night ambush on a Japanese supply bridge. He waited until a truck was in the middle of the bridge, then gave a tug on a cord tied to his Bren gunner. The ambush destroyed the truck and killed 9 Japanese. The admin box proved that encirclement was not fatal. As long as the air could resupply and the perimeter held, the Japanese could be beaten. This was a turning point in the war. Slim's insistence on all-round defense and aerial supply was validated. The Japanese never adapted their tactics to counter it. They kept attacking and dying. Around the same time, another battle was raging in New Guinea. The Australians were fighting a different kind of jungle war. Private B.R. Roffey of the 2nd 7th Independent Company was part of a patrol near Seppu. Before dawn, the Japanese overran his position. A Japanese officer attacked him with a sword. Roffey took at least 13 sword wounds across his head, arms and body. Roffey later wrote a detailed account of his survival. He had a bullet through his bicep and another in his leg. The Japanese officer tried to shoot him with a pistol, but it misfired. Roffey crawled into the jungle. He had no food for 3 days. He drank water collected in fallen leaves. He finally made it back to the main position at Limbian. Barely alive, he survived missing part of his index finger. The Australian soldier was a different breed. They were pragmatic and suspicious of glory. The official history of the New Guinea campaign noted that Australian troops often existed on long patrols like wild animals. They discarded steel helmets and respirators to lighten their loads. They learned to fight with relentless, grim determination. They slowly pushed the Japanese back through the mountains. In Burma, the Japanese launched the main punch of Operation Yugo in March 1944. The fighting around Imphal and Kohima was savage. The Japanese tried to encircle the Allied positions. They infiltrated through the jungle, using the same tactics that had worked in Malaya. But this time, the Allies did not panic. Slim's men had been trained to meet infiltration with counterattacks. The Japanese tanks came as a shock. At Sonlaichong, on March 12, 1944, the enemy used tanks for the first time in that sector. Major CMAR Roberts of the 10th Gurkha Rifles watched in horror as the tracked vehicles ground forward. The sound of their engines echoed through the teak forest. The mules panicked and struggled against their ropes. Roberts' men stood tense, waiting for orders. Roberts described the terror of that night. The tanks seemed to be everywhere. They drove past his position, only yards away. The men moved out in a long file, parallel to the road. The noise of the tanks covered the sounds of their cutting through the jungle. They marched all night, exhausted and terrified. Roberts later wrote that the relief of escaping those tanks was indescribable. A few days later, a Gurkha unit fought a desperate battle defending a 25-pounder gun position. Ganju Lama, a Naik in the 2nd 5th Gurkha Rifles, was part of that action. Japanese tanks were stuck in the mud. Lama used a Piite, the infantry anti-tank weapon, to destroy the first tank. The crew jumped out and were killed. He fired again at a second tank, hitting it. A ricocheting round wounded his foot, but he kept fighting. He was evacuated to the medical post in the rear and survived his wounds. The Japanese tank attack at Sonlaichong was a blunt instrument. They used tanks without proper infantry support in the close jungle. The tanks were vulnerable to ambush. The Gurkhas learned to attack them with grenades and the Piet. The Japanese never repeated the performance on that scale in Burma. The lesson was clear. Tanks could be used in the jungle, but they needed careful protection. On March 24, 1944, the Allies suffered a severe blow. Ord Wingate was killed in a plane crash in Burma. He was on his way back from a forward base. The loss was devastating to the Chindits. Wingate had been their driving force. He was eccentric, brilliant, and ruthless. The Japanese 15th Army commander, General Renea Mutagichi, later said that he had found his match in Wingate. He prayed for his soul. The Chindits continued to fight after Wingate's death, but the campaign was winding down. Many of the units were exhausted. The men who had marched hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines were sick and demoralized. Yet they had achieved something important. They had shown that the Japanese rear areas were not safe. The myth of the jungle Superman was cracking. The Japanese leadership was also failing. They were losing officers in large numbers. Major Takamura was relieved of command for lack of zeal. General Nakano upbraided his division for poor leadership, weak morale, and lost prestige. The Japanese soldier was brave, but his officers were often rigid and unimaginative. They repeated the same mistakes, outrunning supply, using the same tracks, and dying in the same ambushes. The Australian campaign in New Guinea was also turning. The Japanese were being pushed back from the Kokoda track. Australian artillery was devastating their positions. The Japanese blamed the guns more than any other weapon. The Australians learned to set ambushes on the same tracks that the Japanese used again and again. They killed hundreds of enemy troops who refused to learn. One Japanese officer wrote a captured document that became famous. He described the enemy as slow and steady, but said that once they gained confidence, they fought with gallantry. He was speaking of the Americans, but the same could be said of the Australians and British. The jungle had been a mystery. Now it was a place where the Allies could fight and win. The siege of Imphal and Kohima became the turning point of the Burma campaign. The Japanese launched wave after wave of attacks. They tried to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. But the Allied perimeter held. The defending troops were supplied by air. They had enough ammunition and food. The Japanese, living on 2.5 pounds of rice per day, soon ran out. The bravery of the Japanese was undeniable. General Slim himself admired their courage. He wrote that he knew of no army to equal them. They committed suicide by blowing themselves up under tanks. They would not surrender. But their courage was wasted on a bad plan. The Japanese commanders ignored logistics. They believed that spirit alone could overcome material shortage. It could not. One Gurkha soldier, Man Bahadur Limbu, showed extraordinary stamina. He was shot through the spleen and slashed on the back of the head with a Japanese sword. The medical officer said he should be dead. Man Bahadur walked 60 miles to catch up with his battalion. He grinned at the doctor and asked to return to his platoon. That was the kind of soldier that Slim was building. But the jungle was also a place of cruelty. The Japanese inflicted unspeakable horrors on prisoners. Lance Naik Indra Bahadur Rai of the 1st 7th Gurkha Rifles saw a casualty station where British doctors had been crucified on trees. He and his friends rescued them, but many died. Chandra Bahadur Pun of the 1st 3rd Gurkha Rifles found a Garhwali soldier nailed to a tree by his hands and feet. The sight drove his British officer, Foster Sahib, to a terrible rage. The Japanese behavior was a product of their code. Bushido taught that surrender was dishonor. Prisoners were non-persons. The result was systematic brutality that hardened Allied resolve. The men who fought in Burma were not fighting for glory. They were fighting to destroy an enemy that respected no rules. The atrocities fed the determination to win. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese offensive was broken. The Allies began their counter-offensive. Slim's army pushed south. The Japanese retreated, but they fought every step. The jungle was now familiar to the Allied soldiers. They had learned to move silently, to patrol aggressively, and to live off the land when necessary. The training schools in India were producing soldiers who knew the jungle. The siege of Mitkiina began in May 1944. The town was a key Japanese stronghold in northern Burma. American-trained Chinese troops and American commandos, known as Merrill's Marauders, surrounded it. The Japanese fortified the hilltops with deep bunkers. They had to be killed one by one. The fighting was brutal and slow. The Japanese defenders at Myitkyina fought to the last man. They did not surrender. The Allies used artillery and airstrikes to blast the bunkers open. Sappers cleared the wire. Flamethrowers were used for the first time in the Burma campaign. The battle lasted 3 months. The Japanese lost over 2,500 men. Only a handful were captured alive. The capture of Myitkyina in August 1944 was a major victory. It demonstrated the combined arms approach that Slim had developed. Tanks, artillery, and infantry worked together. Air support was used to isolate the battlefield. The jungle was no longer a barrier. It was a place that could be dominated by a well-trained army. The recapture of Burma continued through 1944 and into 1945. The Japanese were pushed back to the Irrawaddy River. The Gurkhas played a key role in the fighting. Major Roberts marched his company over 300 miles from Imphal to the Irrawaddy. He wrote in his diary about the endless ridges, the dry chongs, and the constant thirst. His men were reduced to skin and bones, but they kept going. One mule handler, Colour Sergeant Ramkrishna Limbu of the 4th 10th Gurkha Rifles, was the only man to bring his mule back to Manipur. He said that horses die easily, but mules do not. He and his mule had survived the mud, the bullets, and the starvation. He went to hospital for 3 days, then reported back for duty. That was the spirit of the 14th Army. The Australian campaign in New Guinea also reached its end by mid-1945. The Japanese were pushed back to the coast. Australian troops had fought through some of the worst terrain on Earth. They had climbed razor-backed mountains where a battalion could be 1 man wide. They had existed on 6 pounds of supplies per day. They had beaten the Japanese at their own game. The Australians faced the same Japanese fanaticism. They learned to throw clumps of earth at suspicious noises. If the noise stopped, it was hostile. They learned to feign death and then use a bayonet on a moving corpse. They fought a savage war where no quarter was given. The Japanese would not surrender, and the Australians stopped trying to take prisoners. The final months of the war saw the collapse of Japanese resistance. Their supply system had fallen apart. Men were dying of starvation and disease. The Allied air forces bombed their rear areas without opposition. The Japanese commanders lost control of their units. Many soldiers deserted, but there was nowhere to go. The jungle that had been their shield became their prison. The atomic bombs in August 1945 ended the war. The surrender came on the 15th of August. In Burma, the Japanese laid down their arms. The 14th Army accepted the surrender of hundreds of thousands of men. It was a moment of immense relief and triumph. The jungle had been conquered, but the cost had been high. For the men who had fought, the war was over, but the memory of the jungle would never leave them. Many became jungle happy, unable to adjust to normal life. J.P. Cross, who had served in the final campaigns, later wrote about the strange loneliness of soldiers returning from long patrols. They were awkward with friends. The silence of the jungle had become part of them. The lessons of the Burma and New Guinea campaigns were codified. The British and Indian armies produced manuals on jungle warfare. The training emphasized patrolling, ambushes, and the correct use of weapons. The Bren gun, the number 36 grenade, and the Lee Enfield rifle were the standard tools. They had been adapted for close-quarters combat. But the greatest lesson was about morale. Slim had written that morale consisted of spiritual, intellectual, and material factors in that order. Belief in the cause was the most important thing. The Gurkhas, the Indians, the British, and the Australians had all learned to fight together. They had overcome the fear of the jungle. They had become a force that could meet any enemy. The Japanese had shown that the jungle could be used, but they had also shown that technology alone was not enough. The reason for their defeat was their failure to adapt. They relied on spirit and ignored logistics. The Allies learned to supply their troops by air, to move in small groups, and to dominate the jungle by patrols. That was the difference. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the myth of the jungle Superman was dead. The Allies had proven that ordinary men, properly trained and led, could fight and win in the most difficult terrain on Earth. The jungle was no longer a barrier, it was a place where soldiers could live, move, and fight. That lesson would be tested again very soon in the jungles of Malaya. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945. The Japanese surrendered, and the jungle fell silent. But the silence did not last. Within 3 years, a new enemy emerged from the same green canopy. The Malayan emergency began on the 16th of June 1948. Communist guerrillas, mostly ethnic Chinese, killed European rubber planters and attacked police stations. The British declared a state of emergency. They had learned the price of complacency in 1942. They would not make the same mistake again. The enemy this time was not the Japanese Imperial Army. It was the Malayan Communist Party, a small but dedicated group of revolutionaries. They had fought the Japanese during the occupation. Now they turned their weapons against the returning British. Their tactics were familiar: ambush, harassment, and the use of the jungle as a refuge. They moved at night, carried light loads, and knew the terrain better than any European soldier. The British forces, still adjusting to peacetime, scrambled to respond. Rubber and tin were the economic lifeblood of Malaya. The communists knew this. They targeted plantations and mines, killing managers and workers alike. The goal was to cripple the economy and force the British to leave. The response had to be swift and decisive, but the jungle was vast. The guerrillas were few, perhaps 5,000 hardcore fighters. They could hide anywhere. The British had to find a way to dominate the jungle without occupying every square mile of it. That required a new kind of warfare. The lessons of Burma were not forgotten. Slim had rebuilt morale through training and supply discipline. The 14th Army had proven that the jungle could be mastered. Now those same principles were applied in Malaya. Every soldier, whether British, Gurkha, or Malay, underwent jungle training. They learned to move silently, to navigate by compass alone, and to live off the land for days at a time. The number 4 Lee Enfield rifle and the patrol ration pack became the tools of a slow, grinding campaign. The early years were difficult. The guerrillas had the initiative. They struck and vanished. They knew every stream, every ridge, every village. The security forces were often one step behind. Casualties mounted. The communists believed they could win through attrition. They were wrong. The British had not only learned to fight in the jungle, they had learned to think about the jungle. The war would be won not by firepower alone, but by intelligence, patience, and control of the population. In 1949, a remarkable story emerged from the jungle. A Gurkha Naik named Nakam Gurung was found by a patrol. He had been left behind in 1942 during the chaos of the retreat from Burma. His company commander, Captain Wiley, had told him to wait. Nakam Gurung waited. He waited for 6 years, living alone in a patch of jungle he had cleared. He grew his own food. He avoided Japanese patrols. He heard aircraft overhead, but did not know the war had ended. When the patrol found him, they thought he was a dacoit, a bandit. Nakam Gurung did not run. He stood still. The soldiers approached him, weapons raised. They spoke among themselves in Nepali. Nakam Gurung heard his own language. Hope flooded through him. He told them he was waiting for Wiley Sahib. The patrol commander did not believe him. He threatened to shoot him as a spy, but Nakam Gurung insisted. The patrol took him back to their base. The adjutant of the battalion was Captain Wiley. The same Wiley. He had been transferred to a different unit after the war. When Nakam Gurung was brought before him, the two men embraced. Both were in tears. Wiley asked Nakam why he had stayed so long. Nakam replied, "I knew you would not forget to send for me." The reunion was a testament to the bond between Gurkha and British officer. It was a bond that the jungle could not break. Nakam Gurung had survived on his own for 6 years. He had not surrendered. He had not given up hope. The Japanese had been brutal to prisoners. Nakam knew what capture meant. He chose to wait, trusting that Wiley would return. That trust had been tested beyond any reasonable measure. It held. The story spread through the Gurkha regiments. It reminded every man that loyalty was not a word. It was a way of life. The jungle, for all its dangers, could also forge bonds stronger than steel. Nakam Gurung returned to service. He had to. The years in the jungle had not counted toward his pension. He needed to serve longer to qualify. He became a police havildar. He lived quietly, but his story was not quiet. It became legend. It showed the British command that the Gurkha soldier would not break, no matter how long the wait. That knowledge was invaluable as the Malayan emergency intensified. The jungle was a lonely place, but loyalty was a weapon the communists could not match. By 1950, it was clear that the guerrillas could not be defeated by patrols alone. They drew support from the rural population, especially Chinese squatters living on the jungle fringe. These squatters provided food, information, and recruits. The link had to be broken. General Harold Briggs, the director of operations, devised a plan. It was simple in concept, but massive in execution. The entire rural population would be resettled into guarded villages. The plan was known as the Briggs Plan. Over 500,000 people were moved into 600 new villages. These were not prison camps. They had schools, clinics, and proper housing. The goal was to provide a better life while cutting the guerrillas off from their support. The squatters were given land and security. In return, they were required to register and provide intelligence. Food was strictly controlled. Anyone caught smuggling supplies to the jungle faced severe penalties. The resettlement was a massive logistical undertaking. It required trucks, building materials, police posts, and a constant presence of troops. The British administration worked closely with the Malay and Chinese leaders. It was not always popular. Some resented being moved. Others saw the villages as a form of imprisonment. But over time, the strategy worked. The guerrillas began to starve. They could not move freely. Their sources of information dried up. The jungle became a prison, not a sanctuary. The intelligence dividend was immediate. Once the squatters were registered, the police could identify strangers. Food denial forced the guerrillas to spend more time foraging and less time fighting. They became vulnerable to ambushes. The security forces set up roadblocks, checkpoints, and listening posts. Every bag of rice was accounted for. The communists tried to smuggle supplies through the jungle. They used porters who walked for days. But the noose was tightening. The Briggs Plan was not a quick victory. It took years to implement fully, but it changed the nature of the campaign. The British were no longer chasing a ghost. They were controlling the environment. The guerrillas could not survive without food. The villages were the key. Whoever controlled the food supply controlled the war. The communists understood this. They tried to attack the villages, to intimidate the settlers, to break the system. They failed. The villages held. On the 6th of October 1951, the communists struck a devastating blow. Sir Henry Gurney, the British High Commissioner to Malaya, was travelling by road through the Fraser's Hill region. His car was ambushed by a guerrilla squad. The attackers raked the vehicle with automatic fire. Gurney was killed instantly. His wife, seated beside him, was wounded but survived. The assassination sent shockwaves through the administration. The war had just become personal. Gurney had been a capable administrator. He understood the complexities of Malayan society. His death was a serious loss. The communists celebrated. They believed they had struck a mortal wound against British morale. For a time, they were right. There was panic in some quarters. The security forces tightened their routines. No one travelled without an escort. But the British did not withdraw. They did not negotiate. They appointed a new man to take command. The man chosen was General Sir Gerald Templar. He arrived in February 1952. Templar was a soldier diplomat with a ruthless streak. He took full control of both the military and the civil administration. He believed that the campaign could not be won by force alone. It had to be won by winning the hearts and minds of the people. He told his officers, "The answer lies not in pouring more soldiers into the jungle, but in the hearts and minds of the people." Templar's approach was comprehensive. He improved intelligence gathering. He increased the rewards for information leading to guerrilla capture. He insisted on good behavior from the security forces. There would be no brutality, no reprisals against civilians. The government had to be seen as the better option. At the same time, he intensified patrols. He brought in special forces, including the SAS, to operate deep in the jungle. The pressure on the guerrillas increased relentlessly. Under Templar, the unified command structure flourished. The police, the army, and the civil administration worked together with a single purpose. There was no rivalry between departments. Every operation was coordinated. Templar was known to visit outposts at dawn, asking junior officers what they had learned. He demanded results. He got them. By the end of 1952, the number of guerrilla incidents was falling. The communists were being pushed back. The initiative was shifting. In 1953, a young Gurkha officer named J.P. Cross was leading a patrol in the Malayan jungle. He had served in Burma during the war. He knew the jungle well, but he carried a burden that no amount of experience could remove. He had a recurring nightmare. In the dream, he fired his carbine at a gorilla. The carbine jammed. The gorilla turned and killed him. Every time he had the dream, he woke in a muck sweat. He could not shake it. Late one afternoon, Cross and 3 Gurkhas were on patrol. The jungle was thick and dark. They heard the sound of an axe on wood. They crept forward, senses alert. They came to a clearing where Chinese guerrillas had made a vegetable garden. 2 men were digging at the far end. Cross crawled to a fallen tree to get a better position. He gave his orders softly. He aimed at one of the men. He squeezed the trigger. The carbine fired. The man was hit. But as the gorilla fell, he turned and faced Cross. Cross squeezed the trigger again. Nothing. The carbine had jammed. For a split second, Cross froze. This was his nightmare. It was happening real and vivid. He gasped audibly. His men, thinking he had been hit, turned to look. They stopped firing. The gorilla scrambled to his feet and ran. Cross shouted the Gurkha battle cry, "Ayo Gurkhali," but it was too late. The 2 guerrillas vanished into the jungle. Cross had hit the man, but the jam had cost him the kill. His men opened fire again, but the guerrillas were already over the fence. Cross searched for them through the night. He found nothing. The abandoned rifle they left behind belonged to his commanding officer, killed in an ambush 60 miles away months before. Cross could not sleep. He was ashamed, he was angry, but he was alive. The nightmare had come true, and he had survived it. He would never have that dream again. The incident haunted Cross for years. It was a botched contact, one of many in the campaign. But it taught him something important. The jungle was a place where the unexpected could always happen. Training and drills were essential, but the sudden reality of combat could break any plan. The best soldiers were those who could adapt, who could keep their nerve when the world turned to chaos. Cross continued to serve. He finished his career as a lieutenant colonel. He never forgot that day. The end of the emergency was not a single battle. It was a slow strangulation. By the late 1950s, the guerrillas were reduced to small bands, constantly on the move, unable to recruit, unable to resupply. The Briggs Plan had cut them off from the population. Templars' Hearts and Minds campaign had won the loyalty of the villagers. The police and army, working together, had learned to predict enemy movements. The communists no longer held the initiative. Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first prime minister of independent Malaya, played a key role. He offered amnesty to those who surrendered. Many took it. The hardcore fighters, perhaps a few hundred, remained in the jungle, but they were no longer a threat to the state. On the 31st of July 1960, the government declared the emergency over. The war was won. It had lasted 12 years. It had cost thousands of lives, military and civilian. But it had ended in victory. The Malayan emergency became a model for counterinsurgency worldwide. It showed that a determined guerrilla movement could be defeated without mass destruction. The key was intelligence, population control, and unified command. The British had applied the lessons of Burma to a new kind of war. They had adapted. They had learned that the jungle was not the enemy. The enemy was the man who used the jungle, and he could be beaten. The role of the Gurkhas in the campaign was significant. They served as jungle scouts, as patrol leaders, as the backbone of many operations. Their loyalty and endurance were legendary. The story of Nakam Gurung was known to every Gurkha. It was a reminder that their bond with their officers was unbreakable. The British trusted the Gurkhas trusted the British. Together they dominated the jungle. The communists could not match that combination. For the British soldier, the Malayan emergency was a harsh but effective teacher. The drills learned in Burma were refined. The use of the patrol ration pack, the Lee Enfield rifle, and the Bren gun became second nature. Men learned to live in the jungle for weeks at a time. They learned to read tracks, to listen for unnatural sounds, to move without leaving a trace. The jungle was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of work, hard, dirty, dangerous work. The success of the emergency had strategic consequences. Britain retained access to Malayan rubber and tin. The new nation of Malaya was stable and pro-Western. It became a strong ally in the Cold War. The British demonstrated that their empire could manage transition to independence without chaos. That was not a small achievement. In an era of decolonization, Malaya was a success story. The Jungle Campaign had contributed directly to that outcome. The communist defeat in Malaya did not mean the end of jungle warfare. The same tactics, the same weapons, the same determination would be tested again. This time in Borneo, against Indonesia, between 1963 and 1966. The lessons of Malaya would be applied in a different environment, with a different enemy. The British Army had become a specialist in jungle operations. That expertise would prove invaluable in the years ahead. For the men who fought in Malaya, the memory of the jungle never faded. They remembered the heat, the rain, the leeches, the tension. They remembered the nights spent in wet clothes, listening for the snap of a twig. They remembered the friends who did not come back. But they also remembered the pride. They had done what the Japanese could not have imagined in 1941. They had mastered the jungle. They had used it to defeat a determined enemy. The Malayan emergency was not a war of great battles. It was a war of patrols, of ambushes, of long, patient hours in the green gloom. It was a war won by junior leaders, by corporals and lieutenants who made decisions in the moment, far from any commander. It was a war that proved the value of training, of morale, of trust. The jungle demanded all of these, and the men who fought there gave everything they had. When the emergency ended, the world took notice. The British had shown that a guerrilla insurgency could be defeated. The principles were simple: control the population, deny supplies, dominate the jungle through constant patrolling, and win the trust of the people. It was not a quick solution, it took 12 years, but it worked. The jungle, once a place of fear and defeat, had become a place of victory. The lesson would be tested again, soon, in the jungles of Vietnam. The French garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell on the 7th of May, 1954. After 56 days of siege, the Viet Minh had pulled artillery up mountainsides that French planners said were impassable. The surrender of over 10,000 French troops marked the end of French rule in Indochina. It also opened the door for American involvement in Vietnam. The United States watched the fall of Dien Bien Phu and drew its own conclusions. General Vo Nguyen Giap had studied the Japanese defeats in the jungle a decade earlier. He understood that a lighter supply line and the willingness to accept heavy casualties could offset superior firepower. His soldiers hauled dismantled howitzers up slopes considered vertical by French engineers. They dug tunnels, built trenches, and starved the garrison into submission. Giap had turned the jungle from a barrier into an ally. The Geneva Accords that followed divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The northern half fell under communist control, led by Ho Chi Minh. The southern half became a separate state backed by the United States. The agreement called for elections within 2 years to reunify the country. Those elections were never held. American advisors began arriving in South Vietnam in small numbers during the late 1950s. They trained the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in conventional warfare, but the enemy they faced was not a conventional army. The Viet Minh had transitioned into the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force that melted into the jungle after each attack. The war that followed would not be won by set-piece battles across the South China Sea. The British had just concluded their own jungle campaign. The Malayan emergency had ended in victory in July 1960. The British approach had relied on population control, intelligence, and aggressive patrolling. The Americans, however, viewed their own mission in Vietnam through a different lens. They saw it as a test of containment against global communism, not a local insurgency. The French defeat had taught a bitter lesson about fighting Asian revolutionaries in jungle terrain. The Americans believed that superior technology and firepower would make the difference. They were about to learn that lesson all over again. The jungles of Vietnam would swallow battalions whole and ask for more. A decade after Dien Bien Phu, a different kind of jungle conflict flared on the island of Borneo. In September 1963, Indonesia's President Sukarno declared a policy of confrontation against the new Federation of Malaysia. The British, still holding bases in Singapore and Malaya, responded by deploying Commonwealth forces to defend the jungle border that divides Borneo between Malaysia and Indonesia. The terrain in Borneo was among the densest on Earth. Primary rainforest covered the mountainous spine of the island. Rivers ran swift and brown between ridges that rose to 8,000 feet. The border between Malaysian Sarawak and Sabah and Indonesian Kalimantan ran for over 1,000 miles. There were no roads, no fences, and no clear lines on the ground. British commanders had learned from the Malayan emergency that intelligence was more important than firepower. They established a network of listening posts and patrol bases along the border. Gurkha battalions, veterans of Burma and Malaya, took up positions in the jungle. They operated in small groups, often for weeks at a time, living off rations and rainwater. The helicopter had matured since the Second World War. The Bell OH-1 Iroquois, known universally as the Huey, became the backbone of tactical mobility in Borneo. It could lift a platoon into a clearing deep in the jungle in minutes. It could extract casualties from positions that would have taken days to reach on foot. The helicopter did not replace the infantryman, but it made him faster and more flexible. The British approach in Borneo emphasized restraint. Commanders did not seek a decisive battle with the Indonesian army. They aimed, instead, to control the border and deny the enemy access to Malaysian territory. Patrols crossed into Kalimantan only to gather intelligence and then withdrew. The goal was to contain the conflict, not to escalate it. The confrontation lasted 3 years and ended in 1966 with a negotiated settlement. Indonesia's government changed hands after an internal coup, and the new leadership abandoned the policy of confrontation. British jungle tactics had succeeded through discipline and limited objectives. The same principles were being tested far more destructively on the other side of Southeast Asia. In August 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin changed the course of the Vietnam War. The United States reported that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked an American destroyer. The attack may or may not have happened as described, but the American Congress passed a resolution authorizing military action. The war escalated from advisory to open combat. American aircraft began bombing North Vietnam in early 1965. The campaign, codenamed Rolling Thunder, aimed to destroy North Vietnamese industry and infrastructure. Far from breaking the enemy's will, the bombing drove the North Vietnamese deeper into the jungle. They dispersed their supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths and roads that snaked through Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the logistical backbone of the communist war effort. It ran for thousands of miles under triple canopy jungle. American pilots struggled to find targets through the green roof below them. Bombs fell on empty forest while trucks and porters moved supplies south. Defoliants were sprayed to strip the leaves, but the jungle always grew back. The contrast with Borneo was stark. In Borneo, the British had used helicopters to patrol a border and relied on local intelligence. In Vietnam, the Americans used helicopters to transport entire battalions into the jungle for search and destroy missions. The enemy was not fixed in place. He moved when bombed and reappeared somewhere else. North Vietnamese regulars began moving south in larger numbers. They brought heavy weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and determination. The Viet Cong, the southern guerrillas, received reinforcements and supplies from their northern allies. The jungle hid them all. American commanders called for more troops, more bombs, and more technology. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. The flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail had not been cut. The bombing had not broken Hanoi's will. The Americans had the firepower, but the enemy had the patience. The first American combat troops had landed at Da Nang in March 1965. They were Marines, and they came ashore with full battle gear and television cameras rolling. The American public watched its sons deploy to a distant jungle war. The mood was confident. The military believed it could win through overwhelming force. The American soldier arriving in Vietnam stepped into a world that British and Gurkha veterans had long understood. The heat was oppressive, the visibility short, and the enemy invisible. But American training had not emphasized jungle living. Soldiers were rotated through on 12-month tours, barely long enough to learn the terrain before they left again. British officers who visited American units noted the difference. The American approach relied on fire support bases, artillery, and airstrikes. Patrols were often large and noisy. The enemy, by contrast, moved in small groups, used the cover of darkness, and struck only when the advantage was his. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. Helicopters became the symbol of American mobility in Vietnam. Hueys lifted troops into landing zones hacked out of the jungle. They evacuated wounded, delivered supplies, and provided gunship support. But the helicopter also made predictable patterns. The enemy learned to wait near landing zones and ambush the troops as they stepped off the skids. The North Vietnamese adapted to American technology. They dug tunnel complexes that could survive bombardment. They built bunkers with overhead cover thick enough to withstand artillery. They moved at night and rested during the day. The Americans could control the ground they stood on, but they could not control the jungle. By 1967, the war had become a grind of attrition. American commanders measured progress in body counts. The enemy seemed willing to absorb any number of casualties. The jungles of Vietnam were turning into a graveyard for both sides. The war was bleeding America's morale as surely as it bled its treasury. On the 31st of January 1968, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive. They attacked over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. The scale of the assault caught the American command by surprise. Saigon was attacked from within. The United States Embassy compound was breached. The war had reached the heart of the capital. Communist forces suffered devastating losses during Tet. Tens of thousands of their fighters were killed or captured. Militarily, the offensive was a disaster for the enemy. But the psychological impact on the American home front was catastrophic. Television screens showed the embassy under fire and cities in flames. The message was clear: this war was not about to end. American public opinion turned sharply against the war. The gap between official statements and visible reality had grown too wide. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Peace talks began in Paris, but they would drag on for years. The Tet Offensive had not won the war for the communists, but it had broken the will that sustained American involvement. In Borneo, the confrontation had ended 2 years earlier with no such trauma. The British had kept the conflict limited and controlled public expectations. There had been no television coverage of jungle ambushes, no body counts broadcast nightly. The difference was not just in tactics but in political strategy. The Americans had never defined what victory meant in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese understood this better than their adversaries. They saw the war as a struggle for national unification, to be fought over decades if necessary. American forces rotated home. The Vietnamese stayed. The jungle was their sanctuary, their supply route, and their home. They had learned from Giap's victory at Dien Bien Phu that patience defeats firepower. The Tet Offensive was the turning point, though the fighting would continue for 7 more years. American forces began to withdraw under a policy called Vietnamization. The South Vietnamese army would take over the fighting. American air power would continue to support them. But the withdrawal had begun, and the enemy sensed victory. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. American combat troops left Vietnam. The North Vietnamese released American prisoners of war. The agreement called for a ceasefire and a political settlement. Neither side intended to honor the terms. The fighting continued between South Vietnamese and Communist forces. Without American air support and logistics, the South Vietnamese army could not hold. The North Vietnamese launched a major offensive in early 1975. They rolled through the Central Highlands, capturing provincial capitals one by one. The South Vietnamese defense collapsed in a series of panicked retreats. The end was near. On the 30th of April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city fell within hours. American helicopters evacuated the last embassy personnel from rooftops as crowds of Vietnamese tried to climb aboard. The war that had consumed a generation was over. The communists had won. The fall of Saigon was a catastrophe for American strategy and a triumph for Vietnamese endurance. The United States had deployed over 2.5 million soldiers, dropped more bombs than in all of World War II, and spent billions of dollars. The North Vietnamese had outlasted the most powerful military on earth. The jungle had helped them do it. In Borneo, the British had learned that winning jungle warfare meant winning the support of the people who lived there. In Vietnam, the Americans had tried to win by destroying the jungle itself. Defoliants, bombing, and bulldozers had stripped vast areas of forest, but the enemy had burrowed deeper or moved elsewhere. The physical environment could not be conquered by technology alone. The confrontation and the Vietnam War ran parallel in time but diverged completely in outcome. Borneo ended quietly at a negotiating table. Vietnam ended in chaos and collapse. Both conflicts were fought in the same type of terrain. The difference lay in the strategy, the restraint, and the understanding of what the jungle demanded. That lesson would not be forgotten by those who paid attention. For military thinkers in the United States and Britain, the images of helicopters lifting off from rooftops in Saigon demanded a hard look at what had gone wrong. The jungle had defeated the most technologically advanced army in history, not through set-piece battles, but through patient attrition and the refusal to surrender. The question that hung in the air was simple. What could be salvaged from the wreckage of that defeat? The answer came from 2 very different directions. In the United States, the military largely turned away from counterinsurgency. The army wanted to fight conventional wars against conventional enemies. In Britain, the lessons of Malaya and Borneo were already written into training manuals that emphasized small unit initiative, intelligence-driven patrolling, and the primacy of the infantryman. The British Army had spent more than a decade operating in the jungle after the Second World War. They had learned that domination of the ground came from the boots of soldiers who could live and fight under the canopy, not from firebases or B-52 strikes. By the late 1970s, a revised British Army manual on tropical warfare began to circulate among officers. It was a slim document, barely 100 pages, but it distilled decades of experience into practical drills for limited visibility and close terrain. The manual did not promise easy victories. It warned that the jungle itself was an adversary, that it could never be taken for granted, and that the soldier who ignored its laws would pay in blood. The core principles were unchanged from the days of the Burma campaign: stealth, patience, accurate fire, and the ability to live off the land. The man who had commanded the jungle warfare school in Malaya, Lieutenant Colonel J.P. Cross, watched these developments from a distance. By the time the manual was being written, he was retired in the United Kingdom, his 38 years of service in Asia behind him. He had seen the jungle from every side, as a young officer in Burma, as a platoon commander hunting guerrillas in Malaya, as a battalion commander in Borneo. He knew that the lessons of those campaigns were not theoretical. They had been paid for in lives, and they could not be allowed to fade. The American military took longer to absorb the same message. After Vietnam, the officer corps spent more than a decade rebuilding conventional capabilities for a potential war in Europe. Counterinsurgency was treated as an aberration. a distraction from the real business of war. It was not until the 1990s, when small wars in Somalia and the Balkans exposed gaps in American doctrine, that the army began to look back at the lessons of Vietnam. Even then, the jungle was no longer the primary concern. The battlefield had shifted to deserts and mountains. On the 7th of October 2001, American forces invaded Afghanistan. The terrain was not jungle, but it was equally unforgiving. Mountain passes that rose to 8,000 feet, narrow valleys where visibility was measured in meters, and an enemy who knew every trail and cave. The principles of jungle craft suddenly had a new relevance. The soldier who could move silently, navigate by compass, and react instantly to the unexpected was the same soldier who could survive in the Hindu Kush. The enemy was different, but the tactical problem was strikingly familiar. The early stages of the Afghanistan campaign were fought by small teams of special operations forces, working with local allies and calling in precision airstrikes. It was a model that bore a strong resemblance to the British experience in Borneo. The emphasis was on intelligence, on building relationships with the local population, and on striking only when the target was confirmed. The American military, for the first time in decades, was fighting an asymmetric war in close terrain without relying on massive firepower alone. But the lessons of Malaya and Borneo were not universally applied. As the war in Afghanistan dragged on, the Machian increasingly fell back on the tactics that had failed in Vietnam. Large-scale operations, heavy reliance on air power, and a focus on body counts replaced the patient, intelligence-driven approach that had worked in the jungle. The enemy adapted, using the same techniques that the Viet Cong and the Malayan communists had used: booby traps, ambushes, and the exploitation of civilian discontent. The British experience in Afghanistan followed a different trajectory. The soldiers who deployed to Helmand Province had been trained in the principles that Cross had spent decades refining. They understood that winning meant dominating the ground, not just holding it. They knew that a single soldier on patrol, moving silently and observing carefully, was worth more than a dozen bombs dropped from the air. The jungle had taught them that the man who controls the ground controls the outcome. And that lesson applied just as well to the dusty villages of southern Afghanistan. By the time the British Army produced the year 2000 edition of its Tropical Warfare Manual, the cycle had turned full circle. The document that Cross and his contemporaries had helped shape was now being used to train soldiers for operations in the mountains of Central Asia. The drills for patrolling by night, for reacting to an ambush, for living on limited rations and moving without a trace, all of them had been forged in the jungles of Burma, Malaya, and Borneo. The terrain had changed, but the principles had not. Spencer Chapman survived the war and chronicled his ordeal in The Jungle is Neutral. Jay Lindo and Charles Moore returned from the Chindit columns, the memory of the Burmese guide who saved them never fading from their thoughts. Hira Gurung lived out his years in Nepal, his military medal a record of his service. B.R. Roffey recovered from 13 sword wounds and returned to his farm in South Australia. C.M.A.R. Roberts survived the long marches and later wrote of his experiences. Ganju Lama healed from his wounds and survived. Mambahadur Limbu, who walked 60 miles with a shattered spleen, served on until the war's end. Ramkrishna Limbu brought his mule back to Manipur, the only handler to do so. Chandra Bahadur Pun carried the memory of the atrocities he witnessed. Nakam Gurung's faith in Waili Sahib was honoured. He served as a police havildar after the war. Of the commanders, Henry Gurney was killed in a 1951 ambush. Harold Briggs died in 1952, but his plan endured, and Gerald Templer continued in service until his death in 1979. Ord Wingate's legacy of long-range penetration lives on. The physical objects that defined their era, the Lee Enfield rifle, the Bren gun, the Bell UH-1 helicopter, are gone, replaced by newer machines. But the human element, the courage and endurance of those who fought under the canopy, remains unchanged. If you served in the jungles of Southeast Asia, or if your father or grandfather carried a rifle through Burma or Malaya, we would like to hear from you. Share your memories in the comments below, whether they are stories of patrols and ambushes, or simply the memory of the heat and the rain and the silence of the deep forest. Your experience is part of this history, and it deserves to be told. If you found this documentary valuable, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It helps us keep these stories alive for the next generation. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.